Hey everybody, Mike here with Delta Faucet. Today, I'm gonna walk you through how to install a widespread bathroom faucet with a sunken valve. Now let's make sure you're watching the right video. First, confirm your handles are separate from your spout, which makes it a widespread faucet. Second, let's also make sure your faucet has sunken valves and not traditional valves. If both of these things look good, then you're in the right place. If not, don't worry, we've got other installation videos to help you out. Now, a widespread faucet is designed for a 3-hole sink configuration that has a minimum of 6 inches and a maximum of 16 inches between the center of the outside holes. Now, I think it's a great idea to go ahead and take the time to measure this to make sure that everything's gonna fit correctly. Now, today we're installing the Galleon model, but Delta offers a wide variety of styles and finishes of this type of faucet. Now, the installations for each are all very similar. However, there is a small difference within the handles. I'll be sure to call this out specifically when we reach that step. All right, so let's collect the tools we're gonna need to complete this installation. You will need 2 adjustable wrenches, some safety glasses, a Phillips head screwdriver, and I recommend a long Phillips head screwdriver because it makes it that much easier to work behind the sink, maybe some silicone, a flashlight for working behind your sink, a small bucket for when we flush some lines, and I think it's a good idea to grab a couple towels. Okay, now they've got all those tools and supplies together, let's go ahead and jump on into the installation. So the first step is gonna be installing our end valves into our countertop. But before we begin, I wanna point out a couple things on the end valve itself. You'll notice your end valves at home may look a little bit different than mine. You may or may not have this little plastic piece on top. Either way, don't worry, this installation step is gonna be exactly the same. Next, the 2 end valves do look very similar, but be sure to notice that one is for the hot side and one is for the cold side. Now I'm gonna be installing the hot side first, and I can tell it's the hot side because it has this tag on the supply line itself. Next, we're gonna be installing a plastic gasket up to the bottom of our end valve here. I've got 2 different sets of plastic gaskets. One is my trim color, and the other one is the color of the temperature of the water, a red and a blue, one for hot, one for cold. Now, in my case, I'm gonna be installing my trim color, but if you at home wanna install the color rings, that's totally fine. The only thing I ask is make sure that you're getting the red on the hot side and the blue on the cold side. Now the ring itself has 2 sides. One side's flat, that's the side that's gonna be down, contacting the countertop, and the other side has a little ridge on the top, and that ridge is going to feed up into the bottom of our end valve, just like so, until it seats perfectly flat on the bottom. Now next, we're almost ready to drop it into our countertop, but if your countertop hole is 1 3/8 or greater, I definitely recommend adding this extra little plastic bushing here. You'll see it's got some teeth on it, and what this is gonna do is help keep the end valve centered within your hole. So if you need to use the bushing, we're gonna do it just like the gasket, sliding over the bottom, making sure those little plastic teeth face up, all the way to the bottom of that plastic gasket that we just previously installed. Everything together should come together nice and tight like so. We can go ahead and drop this valve into my countertop hole. But again, orientation is gonna matter here. So I'm making sure I've got the hot side. That's gonna be my leftmost hole. And then also, you'll notice my supply line, I wanna make sure is facing directly away from my center hole. So I'm gonna go on the left-hand hole because I have the hot side. Feed it down in there. Again, checking orientation, making sure that larger tube is facing directly away from the center. And then push everything down into the hole, making sure that plastic gasket isn't getting pinched and everything looks good. All right, great. Now you notice I've installed my end valve on a smooth countertop surface. If you're on a little bit of a regular surface, I definitely recommend adding a small bead of silicone below that little gasket to ensure a nice watertight seal. Now I've got that put in, I'm gonna go ahead and repeat the same exact steps for the cold side, and we'll be ready to move on. Now that we have those end valves dropped into place, we can begin securing them to our countertop. So to do this, I'm gonna be using a mounting washer. You'll see one side of this washer has a cup to it, and the other side is flat. I wanna make sure that cup is facing up towards the underside of my countertop. After that, I'm gonna be using this mounting nut, and you can see that the nut has these 2 locking screws, one on each side. I'm gonna make sure that these screws are preloaded and also sitting below the surface of the nut itself. I'm gonna put those 2 together, and then begin feeding them up over my supply line like so. First the washer and then the nut. And as I move up, I wanna make sure I get that spout outlet tube in there as well. And then I'm gonna start threading the nut onto the shank of the end valve. I'm gonna spin this nut all the way up to the bottom of my countertop. Making sure it's snug, and also checking alignment here, making sure that my supply line is facing, the larger of the 2 tubes, the supply line is facing away from the center of the faucet. and that everything looks good from up above as well. Once I'm happy with it, I'm gonna lock it into place using my Phillips head screwdriver. Tightening one screw, and the other. To lock the valve into place. And when I tighten these up, I don't want to over tighten them. I just want to snug them up because if I over tighten them, I could strip the threads. Okay, I've got that side all tightened up. Now we're going to repeat the same steps for the cold side. All right, with those end valves in place, we can move on to installing our handles. Now this is the step that you might have a slight difference from mine that I'm showing you today. You'll see I have that little plastic piece again on the top of my end valves. If you don't worry, I'll point out exactly what to do to install your handles. Either way, we want to make sure both end valves are in the full off position. So you can use your fingers on the hot side. I want to make sure I'm turning this clockwise until it kind of stops at that position. And then on the cold side, again, this time it's going to be counterclockwise though, to get the valve in the full closed position. Once that's done, we're going to take our handle and we're going to install it over our end valve. And again, I want to make sure the handle is in the full closed position. That's directly away from the center spout. And then on the other side, do the same thing. Now, if you have the version like I do here that has that extra little plastic piece on top, all you have to do is give a little bit of pressure straight down and your handle will snap into place. Now, however, if you have the other version that doesn't have that plastic piece, you'll notice your handle has a little base that will actually screw onto the end valve until it sits snug against the countertop. Either way, go ahead and install both of your handles. All right, now that I've got my handles in place, I can go ahead and check for two things. The first is function. Just go ahead and test your handles to make sure that they're swinging freely into the on and off positions. And then secondly, I also want to check alignment. I want to make sure my two handles are perfectly lined up with one another, facing in opposite directions. Now, if at this point, if you have to make any fine-tune adjustments to make sure the alignment of your handles is perfect, we're going to make those underneath the sink. We're going to go underneath, loosen up that end valve, adjust it slightly, whatever way we need to, and then tighten it back into place. Once everything's looking good on here, we can go ahead and move on to the next step. Now that we have our handles installed, we can move on to installing our spout. So to do this, I'm going to use the rubber gasket. I'm going to slide it over my spout inlet tube, all the way up to the bottom of my spout body, and you'll see that it's got a spot that fits perfectly into like so. Now with that in place, I'm going to hold the whole assembly and drop it into my countertop. Being careful on the hose and the stud. And then as I drop the spout down, I want to make sure that the rubber gasket isn't being pinched between the spout and the countertop. Now you'll notice, depending on your faucet model, it may want to kind of fall forward here, and that's totally fine. We just want to make sure that it's not falling into the sink. But a little bit of a pro tip is if you have an extra set of hands available, or say some painter's tape, you could use a length of it to help hold that spout upright. Which will help make the next step all that much easier. So once everything's looking good, let's go ahead and move on. Now to secure our spout to our countertop, we're going to be using this mounting bracket. Now the mounting bracket has these little bumps on one side. I want to make sure those are facing up and going to come in contact with the underside of my countertop. And also it's got this open area on the other side, which is going to leave enough room for our spout tube. So I'm going to feed this up over the shank of my spout and then hold it in place using this little mounting nut. Now the mounting nut usually comes preloaded inside of this included wrench, but if it didn't, go ahead and preload it now. It'll make things that much easier. Once you're ready, we're going to start by sliding this mounting bracket over the stud of the spout, and then right behind it, hold it in place with that wrench and nut. Once I get it started, too, it might be easier to pull the wrench off, then spin it with your finger. Once I get close to the top, I'm going to put my wrench back on it. And as I tighten this up, I want to make sure that my spout input line isn't getting pinched at all. All right, I've got it snug up, so I'm going to check final alignment. Once I'm happy with it up top, I can take my wrench, give it another half turn or so to snug it into place. And again, just like the side end valves, we don't want to over tighten this because we could cause damage to the threads of the spout. As a little bit of a pro tip here, you can actually leave your wrench still on the mounting nut. That way, if you ever need it in the future, you know exactly where it's at. Next, we can begin making our connections here under the sink. So to do this, I'm going to start with my Y connector here. Notice it's got two shorter sides and then a longer side. I'm going to take my longer side and I'm going to push it into my spout tube here and then clip it into place with the blue clip. I think it's a good idea just to make a little bit of a pull down on the tube to ensure a nice watertight connections. Next, I'm going to be inserting my hot and cold inlet tubes into the shorter ends of the Y on the bottom there. Now, in certain applications, it may be required that you want to cut those tubes down to be a shorter length. That's totally fine. We just want to make sure that first, we're not going to cut these too short. And second, we ask that you cut them straight across and along one of these pre-marked lines on the tubes. Once the length looks good, you can go ahead and take the first side, insert it into one end of the Y connector. I'm going to push it far enough that this line here disappears into the connector. Like that. That ensures a nice watertight seal. I'm going to repeat the same steps for the cold side now. All right, that connection looks great. So now we can move on to connecting our supply lines. So I'm going to be connecting my hot supply line to my hot stub out here. You'll notice that sometimes the supply line might be a little too long for your application, and that's totally fine, but we don't want to cut the supply line. There's a couple things we can do. The first is to kind of bend the supply line in a helix shape to get to where we need to on the stub out. And the other, if you really need to get some distance out of it, is making a loop in the supply line. Now, I want to point out, if you have to make a loop, we want to make sure that the diameter of the loop, the circle that you're making, isn't any less than 8 inches because it could kink the line. So however you need to, go ahead and bring your supply line to your stub out, and then hand tighten the nut onto the shutoff. Okay, once you've got that hand tightened, I'm going to use my adjustable wrench to tighten up just another turn or two, but we don't want to over tighten it, just snug enough that it's going to make a nice leak-proof connection. Okay, we've got that all connected, so I'm going to do the same steps on the cold side next. All right, all of our connections under here are looking great, so now we can move on to installing our drain. Be sure to check out the videos we have for that, then we'll move on to the next step. All right, now we're moving into the final steps of this installation. The first thing I want to check is making sure that my final alignment looks perfect. So just checking my handles and my spout one last time to make sure everything looks in line and looks great. Once that's done, we're going to move on to flushing our lines. Now what this means is basically running water through our system, making sure we're flushing out any debris that could cause a flow issue down the road. So to do this, we're going to be moving the aerator from our spout. But before I do that, I want to go ahead and put a towel or something similar into the bottom of your sink. That way, if we drop any small parts, they don't go down the drain. Now to remove the aerator, I'm going to be using my aerator wrench. Now on the wrench itself, you'll notice it has all these little knobs that are going to correspond to the indents in the bottom of the aerator on the spout. So grab the wrench, find the side that works for you, for your aerator, seat it into the indents, and then slowly and gently unscrew it. Once you get it started, you might be able to take it out the rest of the way by hand. All right, now that we've got that aerator out, we can set it off to the side. Now, if you didn't see a little rubber gasket come out with the aerator, that's totally fine. Not all models have it. However, I do want to confirm it's not stuck in the spout. So just take a quick peek to make sure it's not still in there. Once that's done, we're going to go ahead and move on to running water through our system, flushing our lines. So to do this, I want to make sure that my supplies are in the off position underneath the sink. Once that's done, I'm going to turn both of my handles into the full on position, like so. And then I'm going to move back under my sink and turn on both of my supplies to allow water to run through my faucet for about 30 seconds or so. Now, keep in mind that since we have the aerator removed, there could be a little bit of extra splashing happening in the sink. So a little bit of a pro tip is I like using my rag, holding it over the end of my spout, which should cut down on the splashing. So once everything looks good, let's go ahead and run water through the system. All right, now that we've flushed our lines, we can go ahead and reinstall our aerator. So same steps, just in reverse, making sure we use the wrench to put the aerator up underneath the spout and screw it back into place. We don't need to over tighten the aerator, just enough so it's snug. Okay, that about wraps things up. Now one last pro tip is the aerator wrench, you'll notice, has these little notches in the side. That's so you can take the aerator wrench and snap it to your supply lines underneath the sink. That way, if you ever need it in the future, you know exactly where to find it. We hope this installation went well for you, and if you have any additional questions, be sure to reach out to the Delta Faucet customer service team. They're more than happy to help.